Okay, it's recording.
All right. So let me just share my screen with you guys really quickly. Just a few things before we get started. I cannot see everybody on my screen, so I'm happy to be interrupted for questions. But if you could raise your little like virtual hand so you pop up to the top of the participants, that would be super helpful for me. And then I will try and sort of anticipate questions that might happen and answer them. But if I don't get to something, please feel free to, again, just stop me before I move on. So today we will be talking about language sample analysis. Hopefully, if you are one of the speech language pathology students, you're familiar with with language sample analysis, at least sort of superficially already. And if you are not, then I'm hoping that this will provide you sort of a good groundwork for what language sample analysis is, why it's important. If you're a special educator, you can also incorporate this into your practice as well. It's super relevant, kind of regardless of what your particular lens is. So just a little bit about me. I did not get my bachelor's in speech language pathology. So I spent a little bit more time in my master's kind of getting my like prerequisites filled and stuff like that. I did study pre-med, specifically neuroscience in my undergrad career, and was really interested in language and cognition. So at the time, I didn't know that speech language pathology was a field that existed. I worked for a few years after my undergrad in special education, which I knew was the population that I wanted to work with. And that was how I found out about speech language pathologists. I worked with a lot of students who used AAC, and AAC was kind of my gateway into speech language pathology, not the other way around. And now I work in Oakland Unified. I've been there for 7 years at the same site. I work with Michelle in the TACKLE program. And I like to distinguish that I am an AAC direct service provider. So in Oakland Unified, as in many districts, there is a team, like a central district level team of AAC specialists. They provide primarily consultation services, consultation to teachers, consultation to parents. They're sort of the gatekeepers of the devices. They in a lot of settings, maybe not at my specific site, they kind of decide who gets one and who doesn't. They don't really work directly with students, and so I prefer working directly with students. And of course, I do a lot of consultation regardless. But but my passion is having like a very strong clinical practice with students, and so. I'm not part of the AAC team, but I do consider myself to have AAC as part of my wheelhouse. So we're going to get into why language sample analysis is important. I want to spend the bulk of today on how to actually do it. And so I am going to walk you guys through not necessarily the like transcription part, but all of the sort of analyses. So like how do you write down what a student says, and then what information we can get from that, as well as some specific considerations for AAC users. Okay, so I would be remiss if I did not first mention the fact that we as speech language pathologists are often really pushed to skip over some of the more accurate diagnostic tools like language sample analysis and like dynamic assessment in favor of evaluations, standardized evaluations that attempt to like quantify disorder in some way. And I'll give you a little bit of an example from IQ testing. So the most famous IQ test is the Stanford-Binet test, and this is a test that Alfred Binet came up with. He came up with these ways of measuring IQ through multiple choice questions, right? So looks a lot like some of the evaluations that we might see in our field. He deliberately came up with this measure as a way to get more attention for kids who needed it the most. So his goal in coming up with this IQ test was to be like, there's probably kids that are falling behind in school and we don't know about them. So of course, like 10 minutes after he comes up with this scale, there are already like people talking about eugenics and being like, let's sterilize the children. Of course, it immediately becomes this like runaway train the minute there's a measurement out there, because there's always this drive to quantify things. And there's something that feels really valid about a number that doesn't feel valid about like some kind of qualitative measure. And because we all have pretty serious implicit biases on a bunch of different measures, we're also pretty incapable of internalizing those measures without using them to justify the people that we already think are superior as being superior and the people that we already think are inferior as being inferior. So, you know, standardized assessment is scientifically useful for sure in some settings. And also on an individual level, there's not necessarily something like instructive that follows from that. There's not like, oh, you're right. Like, I guess I really need to drill idioms because I failed the idioms test. Like, that's not super useful. And so, you know, I just think that the failings of standardization are mostly the failings of humans, which makes it really challenging to talk about this stuff because it often gets presented as like capital T, capital S, the science. These numbers take on this kind of implied scientific rigor that makes us take them far more seriously, and especially makes institutions adopt them much more than maybe they should, and takes away all of the nuance. So my hope in relying very, very heavily on language sample analysis is that a lot of that nuance can be maintained, right? Like two scores on a standardized test, two students who receive the same score may not necessarily have the same skill profile. And so if you use these more qualitative measures that allow a lot more space for clinical judgment, you're going to get a better wealth of information than you would get from something that tries to reduce a student to a single number. So again, you know, like I said, institutions really sort of adopt these standardized measures as being kind of the most accurate. And we can see that when it comes to California Ed Code, right? Like our Ed Code is embedded with some kind of standardized measure that will be met or not met, rather, in order to be eligible for special education services. Part of that is informed by ASHA. ASHA, as our organization, you know, helps lobby for what legislation they would like to see in Ed Code, what they would like to see memorialized in Ed Code. And ASHA, in turn, is sponsored by none other than the publishing companies. So the people publishing the tests donate large amounts of money to ASHA, who then advocate for the tests to become, again, memorialized through most state ed codes. So fortunately, there is also a caveat in most state ed codes that says, if a standardized test is considered to be invalid for a specific student, that other means can be used to determine eligibility. And I would argue that standardized tests could be considered invalid more often than not. Standardized tests are generally, as we know, biased based on cultural and linguistic backgrounds. AAC arguably would be a linguistic background, right? Like, these tests are not normed primarily on students who use AAC as their primary or even supplemental access to communication. So it's really important to consider those things when we're thinking about like how we are assessing students, what kind of information we're getting, and how we're getting that information. So again, language samples are included in sort of the alternative measures, even though they generally are, the research supports that language samples are more accurate than many forms of standardized assessment. So Stacy Pavelko and her team surveyed over 1,000 SLPs working in school settings about their use of language sample analysis. So again, this is like, you know, for decades in our field, it's known that language sample analysis is one of the best, if not the best, measure for, you know, distinguishing difference versus disorder versus typical language development. And unfortunately, their study found that only 2/3 of SLPs are really even using language sample analysis in, you know, in a given time frame. So of those SLPs, a lot of them are creating their own sort of protocols for language sample analysis, even though there are lots of evidence-based protocols that are already out there. Many SLPs, more than half of SLPs, are transcribing those language samples by hand in real time, which again is like not a best practice. It's really hard to carry on. It's next to impossible to carry on 2 language tasks simultaneously. So listening to the student and potentially trying to have a conversation with them if you are the conversation partner for that language sample, and then also transcribing that language sample while you're doing that. And then most SLPs are using conversation to collect their language samples, and there are several other more evidence-based practices to elicit more complex language. So conversational language samples are really excellent for certain things. They are not necessarily the solution to elicit the most complex language. So I'm here today to tell you that language sampling does not have to be some like huge undertaking. It really should be part of your standard assessment practice. I do language samples before I do anything else in an assessment. This used to say language sampling should take you 30 minutes from start to finish, and I changed it because the more I rely on language sampling for my data, the longer it actually takes me. And so I find myself these days spending a lot more time synthesizing and analyzing the information in a language sample than I do the information that I get from standardized testing. Sometimes I don't do standardized testing at all with a student because I feel that confident in the information that I'm able to get from a language sample. But the point here is that, you know, it is possible, even with a very full caseload or high workload or what have you, it is possible to incorporate this into your regular practice. So this is a new study. This just came out over the summer. And it actually shows that even very, very short language samples are very reliable for collecting certain data points. So there are a number, as you can see, a number of analyses that you can do after 3 minutes of a language sample that are just as reliable as like your 30-minute, hundreds of utterances, like whatever language sample. After 7 minutes, there are even more measures that you can do that, again, are reliable with longer language samples. So we can feel confident about using short language samples, particularly if you're using a language sample as one of multiple data sources in like a really comprehensive assessment, and also as a progress monitoring tool. So I write in my goals a lot of times that like a student is going to do X, Y, or Z skill as measured by a language sample. Now, I probably do not have time to collect a 30-minute language sample 4 times a year at our progress monitoring times in order to be able to write the progress report, right? But I could certainly collect a 3-minute language sample. I could probably collect a 7-minute language sample, and I could analyze those things as a means to report on progress. So if you're deciding to use short language samples, I would recommend sticking with the most reliable measures. So like number of total utterances, some of those ones in the first column there, as well as mean length of utterance, which is like sort of the baseline of collecting a language sample. That's like the thing that you want to report, right? It's highly valid and very important to use. And to continue using the traditional guidelines of like 50 plus utterances, right? When you're looking to analyze more specific language features, such as like the presence of certain grammatical morphemes, or if the child's language sample is your primary source of data for making decisions, then of course it's really important to make sure that you have a really robust data set that you're working from. So that said, collecting robust language samples in elementary age students, which is the population that I primarily work with, narratives are the best way to elicit complex language. If you're looking at like adolescents and adults, usually the research says to go with like a persuasive type format. So think of like a persuasive essay that you've written, in your academic career, and think about how you can frame that, how you can turn that into a language sample situation. In terms of narratives, retells, while important for some things, are not necessarily going to elicit the most complex language, but generating a narrative, so like coming up with a story or telling a story that is not one that you have just heard told to you, or a personal narrative, so talking about something from your life. Those are 2 really great ways, evidence-based ways, to collect a really good breadth of language. If you're doing conversational language samples, the guidance is generally to focus on process questions versus product questions. So product questions would be something like, what did you eat for breakfast? Well, that can be answered in a single word, right? Toast. Okay, great. Versus, tell me about your favorite vacation that you ever went on. You wouldn't really be able to answer that in a single word and have it like totally make sense. If a student did try to answer something like that in a single word, that might give you some information about like some of their other skills, right? Pragmatic or otherwise. And then again, transcribing in real time is really not recommended. It's not best practice. Lots of people I think, do this as a means to try and save time and not have to do the analysis later on. If you find that that's something you're really coming up against, Google Cloud has a pretty accurate speech to text software. And you can store up to 60 minutes in the Google Cloud for free. And then after that, it's like pretty cheap per minute afterwards. I don't imagine that you would necessarily need more than 60 minutes, but the thing that I will say about that is that it's useful to do as kind of a first pass, and then go back and listen to your language sample quickly and make sure that everything transcribed correctly. The other problem that you sometimes run into with like voice recognition software is that sometimes it'll correct grammatical errors for you, which is not what you want, right? You want to know when those grammatical errors happen because that's your data. That's giving you information about the student. Okay, so that's kind of the why we want to do language samples. And now we're going to get into some like basic guidelines about how to do them. And like I said, I'll walk you through the process. So generally, when I am transcribing a language sample, I do listen to it after the time that I have actually taken it, and just type directly into like any word processing software. Sometimes for kids with intelligibility issues, like I'll have to listen to the same kind of segment a handful of times just to make sure I heard what they said. Sometimes I also go based on if I appeared to understand what they said at the time, even if I can't understand it now, I might make a note about that in my transcription. I have a little section for notes. But generally, I type directly into Google Docs. I don't include any identifying data. I don't include a name. I don't include any of that. All I do is turn on the numbering function and just start typing the child utterances only, and then stop when I get to 50. If I'm noticing something like at the beginning, they were kind of slow to warm up and we're using like a lot of single words or saying like, yeah, I don't know. And then like towards the end, there was a lot more complex language, I might go a little bit past 50 and then delete out the first 10 utterances or whatever to make up for it. When you're trying to determine the boundaries of an utterance, at the risk of oversimplifying, I would just say that if you think it's a single utterance, it's probably a single utterance. Usually an utterance is marked by a pause of 2 seconds or greater. And it can also be, if they continue talking, it can be signaled by some of the typical things that you would listen for. So either like a drop in voice or a rise if they're asking a question, inhalation, so like taking a breath, a combination of those things. Abandoned utterances, so an utterance that they started and then just, kind of trailed off. Those still count as utterances. It's an incomplete sentence, but it's still an utterance. I type in plain language, so I'm not worried about IPA format or, any of that. I don't know personally anyone who has actually transcribed anything in IPA outside of like, when you're doing the Goldman Fristow or something. I don't know anybody who's ever done a language sample in IPA format. So you probably won't have to either. There's not really a reason to, I don't think. Even if you're working with a student who has a lot of intelligibility issues, I don't find that that transcribing an entire language sample using IPA is particularly helpful. I omit punctuation except for, oh my gosh, I just lost the word for apostrophes. I keep apostrophes. because those give information about like contractions, right? They go in place of extra letters in a word. And then again, type exactly as spoken. So I'm not correcting grammar. I'm not embellishing or adding words. I'm not deleting words that they said. So those are kind of the general guidelines. And then some of the more specific stuff about transcription is to keep words the full morphology of it, even if according to that student's dialect, they sort of delete the G off the ing, for example. Gotta, wanna, have to, and going to, those all get transcribed out as their individual morphemes. So we're counting mean length of utterance in morphemes, which means that we want to have access to each of those individual morphemes, right? So I would type out going to instead of gonna, because I want to make sure that all of those morphemes are reflected, even though it's has kind of become its own word over time. Contractions, like I said, I keep the apostrophe, those get typed as is. I don't include any like filler words like or and then disfluencies. So if I have a student who is a stutterer, I don't include any information about stuttering in the transcription. I might put a note on the side, but again, similar to like transcribing things in IPA, I'm going to get that information from elsewhere. I might want to know how many times they stuttered, but for the purpose of this part of the language sample, I don't really need that information. And then mazes are basically false starts to a sentence. I think this is something that I get a question about every time I lecture is what is a maze? So if I were to start, if I had a sentence, if I wanted to start a sentence and I kind of revised it a couple of times, right? Like I just did. If I had a couple of false starts and then I went through with a full sentence, that would be a maze. Those false starts are called mazes. I don't type those out. The reason being is that I don't want that information included in my mean length of utterance. If I have a student who repeats, there was, I wanted to go to, the baseball game. There was would be a pretty significant amount of additional morphology to add into that MLU that like isn't really providing meaning. And kids in particular have these kinds of behaviors a lot, right? So there are several developmental stages where their brains are kind of moving a little bit at a different speed than their mouths, and it's really common to have some of those revisions. Okay, so for intelligibility, what do I do? If there is one word in the utterance that was not intelligible, I'll type a series of X's to just replace that one word. But if I get to a point where there's 3 or more words in the utterance that are unintelligible, or I can't tell how many words I missed, that's when I would replace the entire utterance with a series of X's. And the reason being that I don't want to give kids, I don't want to skew my data with having more or fewer morphemes than what was actually there. And then the last bit is for run-on sentences, more than 2 clauses that are joined by and, or, and then, those get separated. So if you have multiple clauses and one is an and one is a because, and one is a but so, that's great. Keep them together. That's a single utterance. But I don't know how many of you have worked with particularly young children who tell stories and then, right? So like, it's just a series of events joined by and then. That is not one, 100 morpheme utterance. Those are individual ideas. And the and then functions as sort of like a placeholder for them to let you know that they're still talking. Okay, so let's look at the transcription, which is already partially done for the sake of ease. And hold on.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
Do you, when the word is unintelligible, and then you put XXX, do you count that? Do you don't? You just put 0? But what about if there's more words with that? How do you?
I'll show you. Yeah. Okay. Great question. So let me share this other part. Okay. So you guys can see the sample, right? Okay. So like I said, I have just turned on the numbering function and just kept typing and typing. Again, child utterances only. As I mentioned, I don't have any identifying information at the top. This is just like a temporary document, essentially. I'm not going to keep this. But this is just a really quick way to know when I get to 50 utterances. So then the first thing I'm going to do is, and here's an example of the XXX, right? So here's one utterance that there was only one word that I didn't know what it was. And it doesn't look like there were any for this language sample that had more than that, or an entire word that was unintelligible. This kid was pretty intelligible. He had lateralized S sounds, and so it was like a pretty major distortion, but you still could understand what he was saying. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just select all of this, and now I'm going to turn my numbering back off. And I can either do a word count right in Google Docs. This is going to give me the total number of words, right? 442 for this language sample. Or I can use this text content analysis tool. Hold on. It's linked in, everything is linked in the Google Slides, you guys. So you have access to all of these tools, all of the samples, everything that I use and I'm showing you today, you guys have access to it. So this text analyzer is a free, just like online little program here. Oops, that's not what I wanted. All right, let's try this again. There we go. So I would just paste it into here. And this is another really quick way to get not only a word count, but also the number of different words, which is one of the analyses that you might want to use for your language sample, depending on what information you're kind of looking for. And then they call it here, they call it lexical density. But this is the same thing as type token ratio, which is one of the other analyses that we're going to talk about. So I would write this as 0.43 in my analysis instead of 43.44, but it's the same measure, it's just represented in a different way. So shoot, I wonder how I can go back to this. Okay. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. And then I'm going to go back to my slides here. So that's this text content analysis tool. So total words is going to be the first analysis and probably the easiest analysis. Type token ratio is, again, that's the one that I said is the same thing as lexical density. The type token ratio, if you're not familiar, is just a measure of how many different words to how many total words a student is using or a client is using. And so generally for all age groups, it sort of hovers somewhere in the like 0.43 to 0.45 range. That's what we would consider to be typical. The thing that I will say is that type token ratio is a little bit controversial because it can really be skewed by the sort of like breadth of the conversation or the breadth of the language sample. So you might find that like if you're having a really specific conversation, either about like a specific area of interest or a narrative maybe where like, you know, kind of like a series of events is happening over and over, or you're using the same names and the same characters over and over, you might find that your type token ratio skews a little bit low. So I linked also to an article on Matter, which is moving average type token ratio. And what this does is, and the article teaches you how to calculate a handful of different type token ratios and then average them to get actually a better representation of the diversity of a student's vocabulary. Okay, so mean length of utterance and morphemes is the next one we're going to do. And I'm going to drag these actually into here. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do with this language sample, which I have already done, is copy and paste it into my language sample Google Sheet. So this is all the same information. And what's great about this is that all of these are set up to auto calculate for me. So I don't have to calculate how many morphemes are in a sentence. I don't have to calculate you know, what the MLU is, all of that kind of stuff. So again, like I mentioned, I have all of this available to you, so you'll be able to use it and access it. So here's the thing that I need to do in order to make this. So right now, this is just a word count for this utterance. If I want to turn it into morphemes, which I do because it's a more accurate measure of a student's language, all I need to do is go through and add spaces to indicate morphemes. So here, for example, won't is a contraction for will not. So I'm just going to add a space right there. And now it's counting an additional morpheme. Here, this S is its own morpheme. This is its own morpheme. And the LY ending is also its own morpheme. So if I go through and do this, just add spaces for all 50 utterances, then all of a sudden I have a really nice morpheme count instead of a word count. A couple sort of like picky things that I want to tell you guys about too. For words in past tense that are irregular past tense and you can't really split it cleanly along like morphological lines, the thing that I do is just put an extra little thing in there, add an extra word essentially to indicate that this was past tense. So PT for past tense. If there's like an irregular plural or something, then I might add a PL for plural. And that also helps me if I want to know later on in my analysis, have they used any irregular past tense verbs, then I can just search for it, right? So what's great about this is that it's highly searchable. And then when I'm doing all of my like morphological analysis and I want to know what different grammatical markers they've used, I can do that super easily. So then at the end here, oh, uh-oh, don't freeze. All right, sorry, hold on. Am I frozen or is it just my Google Sheet?
You're not frozen.
Okay.
Just your Google Sheet. It's misbehaving.
Okay. Well, in any case, the mean length of utterance calculates for you at the bottom based on a default of 50 utterances. If you're opting to do one of the shorter analyses, all you have to do is go in there to the bottom. It says like total number of utterances and just change the number. So if you have, 12 utterances, you're going to put 12. If you have 30 utterances, you're going to put 30. And then it'll adjust the mean length of utterance to be a reflection of that number of utterances rather than 50. Okay, let's try this. Okay, here we go. Ugh, rats, what are you doing? So that's mean length of utterance in morphemes. Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit. Okay, percent intelligibility. This, I think, hopefully is going to answer your question about intelligibility that you had just a minute ago. If we can get there. All right, here we go. So like all the rest of the calculations, the intelligibility auto-calculates based on how many intelligible, unintelligible utterances you indicate, and then the total number of utterances. So, oh my God, you guys, this has never happened to me. So in this language sample, maybe this will work. Nope, okay. So in this language sample, there was only the one utterance that had the X's in it, only the one unintelligible utterance. So out of 50, that would mean that the total intelligibility for that language sample was 98%. So if you have, for example, an entire utterance that is unintelligible, the entire utterance is just X's, they get credit essentially for one morpheme in the mean length of utterance. So you've left it in there as a way to, again, kind of like indicate this is how many times out of 50 opportunities, basically, this is how many opportunities they were unintelligible. You want to have that information, but it doesn't really give them, it doesn't really skew the mean length of utterance in one direction or the other, right? So you get to keep, you get the best of both worlds, basically. You get to keep the information about intelligibility without it being like a huge impact on the mean length of utterance. All right. I don't know what your problem is, but hopefully we're back in business. So that's the percent intelligibility calculation. Michelle, what time do you need break?
Yeah, I mean, halfway through is soon. And so anytime that you want to do a break is totally great. And then just whatever it feels the most natural.
Okay. Let's get through these last couple things, and then I think that's probably a good stopping point for a short break. Okay. So then the next one is words per sentence. I'm going to go back to this version of the language sample because now I want to go through and delete every utterance that's not a complete sentence. So, like these are all okay. I'm looking for complete and grammatical sentences. So essentially I need a subject and a verb, right? So most of these are pretty complete, but this one right here, no, that's not a sentence. And yeah, those two aren't sentences. So I just take those out. And now I'm going to do the word count again. And now I have 440 words divided by 48 sentences because I had 50 and I took away 2. And that would be my average number of words per sentence. But you have to make sure that all you have are complete sentences. So imperatives, even though they don't have a subject necessarily, the subject is implied. So it's okay to keep those. But everything else generally should have a subject or a verb. The last one, clauses per sentence, or second to last one, clauses per sentence, I also have calculated on here. And similarly, I just kind of go through and count how many subject and verb pairs there are, even if the subject is implied or like mentioned in another part of the sentence. A lot of these are single clauses, but then I have no idea. When I pick it up, it is hot. When I drink it, it's cold. So that's a 5 clause utterance right there. So I'll just go down the whole row and count how many clauses. And then again, this average number of clauses per utterance will calculate. Easy peasy. Oh, I think I skipped over percent grammatical utterance. So for this column, whether or not it's grammatical, I just do kind of a binary system. If it's a yes, you get a 1. If it's a no, as in like there was a grammatical error, you get a 0. So I also put an asterisk next to the grammatical error. So again, it makes it searchable without adding any additional morphemes because it's not adding a word, right? So that's a way that I can look for, okay, like what kind of grammatical errors were they making if I want to go back and search it later. So that was the only one that was agrammatical in this language sample, making the percent of grammatical utterances 98%. And then this last one I'll talk about, I think it's mentioned maybe in an upcoming slide, is mean syntactic length. So for mean syntactic length, I have this morpheme column just sort of copied over. And I think I took these out already, but what you'll notice is that anything that was a 1, I took it away. So I just deleted any morphemes that were 1s, and then it recalculates essentially MLU, but without the single morpheme utterances. And the times, well, we'll talk about it. The times when I would use this are, for example, if I have someone who uses AAC to communicate and are using a lot of single morpheme utterances to the extent that their MLU actually looks really low, but I want to get a better sense of what they're capable of when they are combining words, that's when I would use mean syntactic length. So I would take out anything that's not a combination of words. I would take out anything that's just a single morpheme and then recalculate MLU based on when they are combining words, what are they doing? How many are they using? Similarly, like I talked about, deleting like the first 10 utterances if it took a kid some time to warm up. If I can't really do that and they were just sort of like reticent and not using a lot of language throughout, maybe they were really shy, I would again calculate mean syntactic length. And so I would take, all of the single morpheme utterances out of there and recalculate the MLU. So recalculate the average based on all of the times that they combined words to make meaning. So you have all these calculations, but then like, what do you compare it to? Many of these are available in Sugar. This is linked to their website. So they're kind of where this method of language sample analysis is adapted from. They have a lot of normative data, including data on mean length of utterance that is, they have a larger age range than the original research on like Brown stages and stuff like that. They have up to, I think, 11 years old, whereas some of the older, like kind of like more traditional data only goes up to ages like 6 or 7. So it's harder if you have kids in that kind of like older elementary or middle school age range to find normative data on those. So that's a good place to compare your normative data to. And then the last thing that I'll say, and then we'll take a break, is that I also have included, there's a link for it right here, and then you guys should have access to like a whole Google Drive folder where all this stuff lives as well. A report template. So if you're doing a conversational language sample, like what could the report look like? If you're doing a narrative language sample, these are both really just like skeletons of language samples. Depending on what information you are looking for or what's coming up in your language sample, there, you can elaborate on a lot of this, but this is just sort of, this is my like, this student doesn't have a problem in language sample report. It usually is a lot longer if I am evaluating them specifically for language. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Michelle, you can do the break business.
Okay, thank you. So as Melissa mentioned, thank you, Melissa, there is a folder that has all of this information. It's up and updated. It says LSA folder 2022. And I just put it up on iLearn. And when you click that, it'll bring you to a Google folder, and inside it will be all of these references that Melissa is talking about. Okay.
Again, it's all linked in the slides. So hopefully maybe that'll be an easier place to find it. I don't know.
Yeah, either way, it's in places. So thank you. And all right, so let's take a break. Melissa, class ends at 40 after. If we take a 5-6 minute break, is that okay? Does that give you enough time? Okay.
Yeah, I think we're almost done.
Okay, so let's come back. If we're almost done, let's come back in 10 minutes at 6:05 p.m. Okay, thanks everybody. Brisa, do you have a question?
Hi, yes, Professor. I sent you a message through the chat. I don't know if you received it.
I'll take a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Brisa, I'll write you an email right now, okay?
Thank you so much.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Melissa, we'll give everybody just a second to come on back. Awesome. Okay, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple other, briefly, a couple other analyses that you may want to consider doing, and then we're going to jump into AAC considerations. Percent of complex sentences. This is very similar to clauses per sentence, but rather than giving you an average number of clauses per sentence, it calculates how many, like what percentage of the sentences were complex. Very similar, but just kind of slightly different. Frequency of occurrence. So if I'm doing a type token ratio where I'm actually dividing out by like parts of speech, I might do frequency of occurrence. So like number of noun or percentage of the sample that was nouns, percentage that was verbs, percentage that was adjectives. This information has been surprisingly helpful to me. So I typically, the two most frequently occurring word types in a language sample or in a typical language sample are verbs first, and then shortly thereafter followed by nouns, which makes sense, right? Like that's the real important information. That's kind of the content information in language. And I've seen students who had like a really wild percentage, like 25% of like pronouns or something, for example. And that right there is an indicator to me like, okay, there's something else that I need to look for in this sample, you know, something's going on. Speech rate in words per minute and then intelligible words per minute, those two measures together are a very, very reliable differential diagnosis for students with mild dysarthria, very mild dysarthria versus typical speech, typical motor speech. And then percent grammatical utterances we talked about already. So, you know, all of this up until this point has been primarily syntax and semantics. We haven't really even gone too much into like the different pragmatic analyses that you can consider doing. If you're interested in language sample analysis, I would really highly recommend this book, Guide to Analysis of Language Transcripts. There are, in the folder that you guys have, there are a couple chapters or excerpts from chapters that I scanned for you so that you can look up, again, norms either for syntax, so like MLU development, and then also some like TTR norms in there as well. But the book is a really, really robust resource for any kind of analysis that you might want to do. There are a lot of examples. There are a lot of samples. It walks you through many of these analyses. I really can't recommend it enough. Okay. So what about AAC? Like, you know, we're talking about students who often are using high-tech devices. We know that these devices oftentimes can like log keystrokes. And so why can't we just like collect that information, like aggregate that information and use one of these, you know, like the text content analysis tool that I showed you earlier. CLAN and SALT are two analysis softwares. CLAN is free, SALT is not, but they both have a really, really robust like log essentially of what students of other language samples so that your sample student can be compared to many, many, many other students. And they both are sort of like, the more people use them, the more accurate and the more robust they get. And then Realize Language is a subscription service that you can use with many of the high-tech AACs to analyze the automated data logging information. So what is the issue with using all of this information? First of all, there is the barrier about short utterances. So this one we talked about a little bit already. If I'm going through and transcribing a language sample by hand, then I can use that mean syntactic length to kind of delete out all of the things that are single morphemes, of which there are often many for AAC users. It's not always as efficient as communicating through natural speech. And so, naturally, people use kind of the simplest terms to get their message across. So that can be a barrier. If you're using automated data logging, you can't necessarily separate those out. It can also take a really long time if you're looking for multi-morpheme utterances. It can take a really long time to get 50 utterances. And again, this is probably a situation where you might not want to use one of the shorter language sample, the shorter language sample options. And then AAC devices, and this I think is one of the more important barriers to consider. It doesn't distinguish between multiple users of that device. And so if you're going to use automated data logging, it's important to be really intentional about when you turn that feature on to log the keystrokes and when you keep it off, and be sure that nobody is modeling for a student during that time. And that doesn't just mean modeling on their device, which of course would count, towards their mean length of utterance or towards their, towards their stats, but also modeling on another device by a communication partner. And I think that it just doesn't seem practical to me, thinking about like how often I'm modeling, because that's a best practice, right? And how often I'm supporting my students to communicate, to then say like, okay, well, like there are going to be all of these times, maybe even up to a month, where I can't actually do those best practices. I can't model, I can't support them, I can't provide any of the scaffolding that I would normally provide. There are also, we can get into some kind of like tricky issues around like privacy and what's being logged if, let's say, we forget to turn automated data logging off before they go home, and then we're logging information that's happening at home, all of that all of that kind of stuff. So for me, I have done enough language samples and I'm familiar enough with doing language samples by hand that I don't think that automated data logging would make it particularly easier for me to do it in that way. So here are a few of the ways that I do collect language samples for students who use AAC. So Chalk Talk and Chapel Hill snippets are both freely available tools for collecting information, not just the like words used, right? The AAC words used, but like collecting information about a whole range of modalities that people communicate in. And then my favorite one is the TALC, the Tool for Analysis of Language and Communication, which maybe you are already familiar with. I know Michelle has also started using it. And then I have included a language sample template for that one also. So including all of the same analyses that are kind of my like standard analyses, but then over on the side, having drop-down menus for the talc information as well. So whether or not those things were prompted and how, what modality was being used to communicate, the purposes for communication, expressing needs and wants, social closeness, sharing information, and social etiquette, I believe is maybe the last one. And then successfulness. So then in this second tab here on the bottom, again, I love things that auto-populate for you, you guys. You'll learn this about me. How it'll auto-populate and auto-calculate what percentage each of those things received in the language sample. So that's a favorite and it's easy to use, etc., etc. Okay, just a few more things. These are some other resources for collecting different types of language samples. The double interview is awesome, and I have been using this more and more recently. I think it's really fascinating. And it's a dynamic assessment / language sample that focuses on pragmatics. It's really cool. So basically what happens is I interview a student, I model how to interview, right? Like what kinds of questions you ask, what hobbies, ask about your family, what do you like to do at home, those kinds of things. And then I show a series of pictures of myself that are like pretty highly contextualized. They contain a lot of information. And then it's the student's job to interview me. So they can use anything that they see in the pictures to help inform their interview, anything that they see in my classroom to help inform their interview. Usually I have pictures of like me with my pets or my family, or me, playing an instrument, or like on a vacation in front of like a cool, background or something. And it's really fascinating what skills can be elicited through this particular type of language sample. So then again, you can transcribe it and analyze it very much in the same way as a conversation, but you get this whole focus on pragmatic skills as well, which I think, oh, not here. I did not add the report template for it to this report template, but I will. So you guys will have access to that too. The Chapel Hill one I already mentioned. They have free protocols both for elementary age and older elementary through I believe high school. Yeah, high school. So those are some other protocols that are again freely available. Leaders Project is really great. I use the school age language measures cards all the time. It's just a series of picture cards, basically the equivalent of a wordless picture book that you would use to inform your knowledge of a student's narrative skills. So can they sequence the pictures? Can they tell a narrative? What parts of the narrative do they include? And then there are usually, for each set of cards, there are some follow-up questions that Leaders Project has created as well, that look at things like theory of mind and inference making skills, and being able to like predict what happens next, those kinds of things. And then these two tools are both new. So this one from Dr. Soto came out, I think it was published in, I want to say April of this year. So maybe like 6 months ago. And it's a language sampling tool, not only for AAC users, not only for people who speak Spanish as one of their primary languages, but for people who fit in both of those buckets. So It's free, it's available online. There is an article where you can learn how to use the tool, and then the tool is also pretty awesome. And then eliciting language samples for analysis, or ELSA, is another new protocol that is freely available. And the focus for this one is kids who are minimally verbal. I want to say they specifically cite autism, but I'm guessing that the protocol and the resources could also be adapted in some way for AAC users. Many autistic individuals also use AAC, so there is some overlap there. And what's cool is that there is a protocol for helping parents take language samples at home, in part because there is a lot of evidence that parents sometimes see better, more robust language in their setting than we do in ours, in the clinic and at home. I mean, at school. Okay. Lastly, just a few kind of like helpful things. Books and articles for narrative language samples or retells or things like that. I love my school library in addition to the public library. Epic is an app. If you're not familiar with it, you sign up with your education email address and have free access to a decent sized library of books, some of which are like, super popular type books. ReadWorks and Newsela or Newsela, I don't know, everybody says it different, are really good places for fiction and also nonfiction articles for, again, eliciting either narrative language samples, or I've used the Newsela for persuasive language samples. I find like, kind of a hot topic sort of debate article, and then have a student kind of express their opinion about whatever the topic is. A few good resources for finding evidence-based practice. The Informed SLP, I think, is really great. They read and review hundreds and hundreds of articles and sort of share the most clinically relevant information in a really digestible, easy to understand kind of way. V, who also lectures at State, is part of their review team. ASHA special interest groups can sometimes have really good information. And if you are part of a special interest group, you also get access to the Perspectives journals, which is, for example, where Dr. Soto's article was published. And then all of you obviously are currently students and have a lot of access to academic publishing resources sort of all over the place, but you may not always be students. And if you need some help finding peer-reviewed articles for free, then Unpaywall can maybe support you. Lastly, SLP Summit is a pretty cool twice yearly week-long webinar conference summit thing, and they provide free CEUs for speech language pathologists. Okay, and that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, I wrote in the chat, but thank you for all of those templates. Those are going to make things really a lot easier for everybody. So who has questions for Melissa?
I'm not leaving without at least one.
Haley?
I have a question. So would this type of assessment be utilized during like a triennial review, or is it used like throughout the year?
Yeah, definitely at a triennial or an initial, obviously, because there is a lot of like diagnostic information there. But like I said, sometimes I'll write goals, and in the goal, instead of saying like as measured by data collection or whatever, or like with 80% accuracy, I'll actually write in a goal like as measured by, like an MLU of whatever in a language sample. So I do use sort of the shorter language sample, maybe not as in-depth of an analysis, but I do use them periodically throughout the year.
Thank you.
So all of you are going to be doing some version of a communication or language sample for your student report using the TALC or the CSA, or if you have a student that is context dependent or context dependent transitional that you could get like a language sample with, she's your expert. So any questions about that you want to run by her for your student report?
And I don't know, Michelle, I don't know when your reports are due this year, but usually in the past, they have had an opportunity to ask questions at the beginning of my next lecture. Once they've like done a language sample or started a language sample.
With the way that timing works out this time, we don't get to do that, unfortunately.
Bummer.
Yeah. I do want to talk to y'all for a moment about the student report when we let Melissa go. But anything else for Melissa?
I guess I might have a question. So we've done language samples, LSAs in undergrad and grad school, but we also had to do social communication samples when you're actually reviewing the facial expressions, the tone and everything going on. Would a shorter language sample or that type of language sample still be appropriate, or would you suggest more of a longer one in regards to that?
The only analyses that I'm aware of for the shorter language samples are the ones like, the MLU and total number of words and some of those ones that were listed. I am not sure of any evidence out there about using shorter language samples for like social stuff. My guess is sometimes that takes a little bit longer to, kind of be fleshed out, but don't quote me.
Okay.
I have a question.
Great.
So my student that I'm looking at is just turned 3, and she's an emergent communicator. And so how do you do a language sample on a student like that?
Yeah, that's a lot of my and Michelle's shared caseload are emergent communicators. So for that one, I would definitely be looking more at like the TALC or a CSA or something like that, where you're really considering all of the communicative behaviors. Doing a communication matrix in advance of the language sample might also be helpful, because that can kind of focus what communicative behaviors you're looking for, if any. So through the communication matrix, you might say like, I'm looking for like XYZ pre-intentional behaviors, XYZ, intentional behaviors, or that kind of thing. And that can help you, again, like focus what you're looking for in terms of like reactions or facial expressions and things like that when you're doing the TALC. I would also recommend a video for sure. It's going to be impossible to capture all of that information in real time.
Thank you.
Those are great suggestions. Yeah, please take a look at the CSA for your emergent communicators. And a TALC is also a possibility, particularly if your emergent communicators are kind of edging toward emergent, transitional, and context dependent. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate you being here. This is always super helpful, and your resources are incredible. So thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay, so for the rest of you, I'm gonna have you hang on for just a few moments, okay? Okay, let's see. Trying to think if I need everybody for this or just a couple of people. Okay, so if you have, I'm gonna go ahead and pause the recording.